Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second event of the spring season at the Brennan Center for Justice. This event is titled Trumpocracy, David Frum in conversation with Trevor Morrison. I invite you at this time to please silence your cell phones. We don't want any ringers going off during the program. I also want to invite you at either of the tables behind you to pick up your spring lineup. We'd love for you to engage with us at Brennan Center on Twitter, Brennan Center on Facebook, or use the hashtag BCJLive. We have two upcoming programs on March 6th and March 20th that we'd love for you to know about, together with Carnegie Hall's citywide celebration of the 1960s, Voting Rights Then and Now, and the Great Society. They celebrate the programs of the 1960s and how they continue to shape our lives to this day. We also invite you at the check-in center to sign up for our email newsletter and be informed of our upcoming events. After the program, Mr. Frum has generously agreed to sign copies of his book. So if you would like to get an autographed copy, you can buy a copy at the sales table and then go to the signing table where Mr. Frum can sign your copy. So with that, in a couple of minutes, Mr. Frum and Mr. Morrison, Dean Morrison, will come out and the program will begin. So again, please silence your phones and have a great evening.
So, excuse me. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Brennan Center of Justice event here at NYU Law School. My name is Faiza Patel. I'm the co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center. The center, for those of you who don't know us, is dedicated to ensuring that our systems of democracy and justice work well for all Americans, especially the most vulnerable amongst us. You can check out all the great work we do online at brennancenter.org. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, all the major platforms, and learn about the various things that we work on. Our guest today is David Frum. He needs little introduction. His career as a political reporter and lawyer and his service in President Bush's White House is well known. I'm sure many of us here today have read his work in The Atlantic, where he serves as a senior editor. And David's latest book, Trumpocracy, The Corruption of the American Republic, is our topic today. Now, I don't think I'm saying anything exciting when I say we live in really tumultuous times. Alongside the sort of daily chaos that envelops this White House, we've all seen the advancement of policies that are deeply disturbing and against everything that the Brennan Center stands for. From a return to the bankrupt tough-on-crime model of the war on drugs, to the Muslim ban and efforts to put this country out of bounds for immigrants, especially those of color, Trump has pushed forward a retrograde agenda. But there's something more fundamental going on here as well, and that's what David seeks to tackle in his work. You know, one of the things that the Brennan Center has been concerned about is that our democracy works not just on the basis of laws, but on the basis of norms and on the basis of institutions. And norms and institutional integrity are a lot harder to ensure than laws and policies are in a way, because you can take a law to court, you can contest it, you can challenge it. You can't do the same in forcing the president to release his tax returns. You know, it's not that easy to go to court and insist that he divest his businesses. Nor will courts, reprimand the president for attacking the press or for constantly asserting fictions as facts. So all of these things are going on that are really attacking the very core of our democratic institutions. And that's the topic of our discussion today. And joining David in conversation is Trevor Morrison, the Dean of NYU Law School, who I'm sure many of you know well. Trevor is also a member of the board of the Brennan Center. And he brings to the discussion the sensibilities of both a constitutional scholar, but also someone who has a practical knowledge of actually having worked in the Obama White House. So I think we're going to have a really rich, informed discussion today, and I invite you both, all of you, to join me in welcoming David Frum and Dean Trevor Morrison.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all, and welcome to the law school. David, welcome. Glad you could be with us. We've just been discussing the fact that among the things we hold in common is dual nationality, both having been born in Canada, but also being citizens of the United States. We didn't get to talk about the implications of that for our rooting interest in the Olympics, and we might cover that later in the conversation. But let's start with the book. It is an absorbing read. It's a provocative book. It's a bracing book in many ways. What was your goal in writing it?
Well, thank you, Trevor. Thank you all. Thank you for coming out on this lovely summer February day. I understand there are a lot more of those in our future, so that's exciting. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a joke that was prevalent in Eastern Europe. How many Poles / Hungarians / Romanians does it take to screw in a light bulb? And the punchline was none. The market will do it. And I think of that when I am told by people say, don't worry, the institutions will save us. Like the market, the institutions are made up of people and are driven by human action. So I wrote the book because I don't think that things happen automatically. The risk of the book, as I say at the beginning, is I'm writing early. There's a lot of history yet to unfold, and I may have made many mistakes of fact and interpretation. But I wanted to mobilize people to rally to defenses of institutions that I see as endangered. Those that were listed in the introduction are some, but there are others too, including the structure of American world leadership on which world peace has depended since the end of World War II.
Mm-hmm. So we should talk about each of those. The title is attention-getting, Trumpocracy. That sounds like a new term of art. So what's its definition?
Trumpocracy is a term that is designed to focus attention on a system of power rather than an individual. Like every journalist in Washington, I read the Michael Wolff book with fascination. I learned a lot from it, and I recommend it to people. But it has, it risks misleading us in ways that actually are detrimental by focusing us on the personality of the president and also on his gaps, his feeblenesses, his gaps in information, his gaps in energy, all of which I'm sure exist. But he is a wilier survivor than he's given credit for, and around him there is a system of power that enables him. I think one of the things that, I don't have to tell a room full of students of law and supporters of the law, but the United States government is a big bureaucratic institution in a highly legalistic country. The president can't just issue edicts and expect them to be followed. He works with others. And the thing I'm fascinated by are those others, the people behind the shoulders of the president.
Mm-hmm. Is it fair to say that the book takes, well, the title might suggest that the book takes as its starting point the beginning of this administration, but in many ways I think it's describing where we are in this administration as a symptom of some set of developments over a much longer period of time, so and that this is less about Trump as cause as Trump as effect or as symptom.
And much wider period of space. Mm-hmm. I won't burden in a talk a lot of statistics because they're, they just, you use one, and if you use two, it's like you used 100. But here's one, if there's one you take away. I cite in the book the work of Yascha Mounk, a German political scientist now at Harvard. He got a big grant to do a multi-country survey before Donald Trump was elected president, in which he asked the question, is it essential to you to live in a democracy? And among people born in the 1930s, about 80–90% said yes across the developed world. Among people born since 1980, about 25% said yes across the developed world. And not just Americans, Canadians, Swedes, Germans, British. So this is a more than American phenomenon. And there are Trumps everywhere. Geert Wilders, remember him? He's now the leader of the second largest party in the Dutch legislature. Marine Le Pen, who ran for president of France in 2017, she lost, but she got twice as much of the vote as her father did in 2002. There's now, for the first time since the war, a right nationalist party in the German federal parliament. So these parties, people like this, mini Trumps, are in outright power in Hungary, Poland, and some of the smaller countries of southeastern Europe. We see democratic regression in less advanced democracies, less consolidated, Turkey, the Philippines. South Africa's just had a transition of power. We'll see whether they are able to get back on a better track than they've been in the recent past. But I think one of the things that Americans would also benefit from is when you have a problem that's bigger than America, you need a bigger than America explanation of why it's happening.
So let me just play devil's advocate for a moment. Some might argue, I'm sure that some would argue, that the diagnosis of this administration as being part of something that's fundamentally anti-democratic needs at least further defense, because on a first pass, it's populism. It's a form of democratic politics that expresses deep skepticism about established institutions because they've malfunctioned, because they've not served well a set of interests of the electorate, of the polity, because perhaps they're thought to be corrupt, or they're just preserving, elitist structures, and that what the Trump administration is the result of a new kind of democratic politics, small d, that is not anti-democratic. It's a new majority expressing a new set of preferences. That's not how you would see it. I'm not saying it's how I would see it, but what would you say to that?
Well, first, it's very hard to be a new majority when you're quite a small minority. You are absolutely right. I mean, since the great surge of growth after World War II came to an end, people have been less deferential to experts dating back to the middle 1970s. And so there's been a lively political tradition of campaigning on behalf of the people against entrenched elites. We're describing the Carter campaign of 1976. Those are Jimmy Carter's themes. And I mean, I didn't like Jimmy Carter much, but I would never have described him as a threat to democracy. Here's what's different. And this is the thing that is uniting all of these different countries around the world. We have the same crisis of confidence in elites that they did in the 1970s. We also have had a long period of very slow economic growth. We also have the baby boomers arriving at retirement age, the biggest, most politically powerful generation in history to date, about to make their biggest claims on the state in every developed country at a time when the state has less to go around. And the baby boomers are saying, protect us at the expense of everybody else. And all of this is happening at a time of rapidly increasing ethnic diversity. The difference between Trump-style populism and Jimmy Carter-style populism is that Trump-style populism and Geert Wilders style and Marine Le Pen style and Nigel Farage style and wherever else this is, they have this problem. Okay, you're the populist, so why aren't you popular? Why does a majority oppose you? And the answer that they all have to come up with is some version of, because those aren't the people we're talking about. That there are a lot of people living in our country, but when we say the people, we don't mean those people. And it is, and that's maybe always there in democracy, but it has become in recent years, because of the economic troubles plus diversity, increasingly explicit. And so a big part of the challenge to democracy that Trumpism, US, elsewhere poses, is that this is, as I see it, an approach to politics that is increasingly explicit, but eliminating from the political nation large numbers of people who live in the actual nation.
But if that's true, is it also a problem that's self-correcting? That is, if we pay close attention to things like access to the vote, perhaps if the Supreme Court decides that partisan gerrymandering is something that it can deal with, et cetera, that the very fact that there isn't a stable Democratic majority in support of this administration on that understanding, or that Le Pen lost. In other words, majoritarian politics is the cure for this problem as well.
Well, I refer you back, Counselor, I refer you back to my opening joke. That could be true, but it doesn't have to be true. And that's what motivates me. And let me put it this way, for a decade, it has not been true. And it has not been true in the United States, and it has not been true elsewhere. Because when Trump was elected, there's a tremendous mood of excitement and dread in the country. And a lot of people would speak loosely with comparisons to the Democratic, I'm going to put this in as mealy-mouthed a way as possible because I so reject the analogy, but to the most notorious cases of democratic breakdown in world history in the central part of Europe in the middle years of this century. And one of the things I wanted among the master ideas of the book is to completely reject that analogy. Because you don't have to come up with the worst democratic breakdown ever to realize that democracy can corrode. The analogy I keep using is that Trump isn't a heart attack of democracy, he is the gum disease of democracy. And you can die from gum disease if it's left untreated, but you have some time. And
this book is a toothbrush?
But I hope it's a hearty swig of Listerine,
there we go.
or the generic equivalent thereof, sure. Which you can save a buck a bottle. Yeah, I mean, it may be self-correcting, but we have to act, and that is the reason to work now. Because until now, what has been happening, unlike the democratic breakdown of the 1930s, which actually turned off democracy altogether, modern authoritarians have discovered they can be much more economical with their use of applications of anti-democratic pressure. I mean, let me direct attention to the most extreme case in the fully developed world, Hungary, Viktor Orban's Hungary. So Viktor Orban is probably the most authoritarian leader in any advanced country. He has not wrongfully arrested a single person. There is no one in a Hungarian prison who hasn't been convicted in a court of law of something that everybody would consider a crime. And yet he's been able to destroy independent media, to corrupt the courts, to corrupt the central bank, and to enrich himself and his cronies, and to redistribute money away from other people's cronies. And he has done all of this in a way that has become kind of self-reinforcing, and it's very hard to see how Hungary claws back. But he's done it without a coup, and there are many people who could say, well, Hungary also has possibilities for self-correction, except it just isn't self-correcting.
So that raises an important point, and Faiza in the introduction talked about norms, so maybe we could talk about them there, because what one would say about Hungary is that, as you say, there's no clear illegality in these actions, but some of them at least have placed major tension on some received norms as to how government was supposed to be conducted. Yeah. Things that are more sort of soft law, not hard law. What concerns you most? And there's a lot of discussion these days that the Trump administration is putting pressure on norms, and some of that I'm sure the administration would agree with. Its goal is to upend some traditional ways of doing things. What are the norms, though, that have been threatened or that are in danger of being threatened that you're most worried about?
Well, let me start with the most spectacular and then move to the most important. The most spectacular is this. The theory of the case is that the president appoints the director of the FBI, the Senate confirms the director of the FBI, and the president can then remove the director of the FBI. That's the theory. The practice is, until now, the president cannot remove the director of the FBI. That when Bill Clinton, the last time a director of the FBI was removed, as I think everyone here knows, there was an elaborate consultative process where the person in question was accused, maybe it turns out in retrospect, maybe unfairly, of not using expense accounts properly. This became a huge argument inside the Clinton administration. The president was convinced it was true. There was notice to the director. The director was allowed to have his case heard. It was taken to the relevant people in Congress. Again, there was no formal law, but there was a kind of consultative process. The whole process took weeks. And at the end of it, the president confronted the director of the FBI and said, not only I, but the heads of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees think you haven't used your expenses properly, you're fired. And that set a norm that the president can't just fire the president, the director of the FBI at will for any reason. The new post-1993 rule, which is sort of what you'd like to see with the head of your your federal police organization, is the head of the FBI has to be fired for cause after getting a lot of buy-in from a lot of other people. Donald Trump has just tried to set a new rule. The president can fire the head of the FBI for any reason, including investigating the president and his friends. And one of America's most important newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, will publish articles from learned people with chairs at the Hoover Institution who will defend that principle. And if this succeeds, that will be the new principle of law. Whoever's the president can fire the director of the FBI for any reason. And many of these people argue that the president can tell the head of the FBI what cases to investigate and what cases not to investigate. And that will be new. The thing so that's the most urgent. Here's the most immediate. I think one of the ways, and again, Senator named for Justice Brennan understands this. The United States has typically been one of the less honest of the major developed countries. Standards of public integrity have been lower here than in Britain, Canada, Australia, Scandinavia, and Germany. I mean, when they're not murdering people.
Do you mean honesty in public discourse generally, or literally in what the government says?
I
or-
mean, you want a new road to your factory, do you bribe somebody or not?
Okay.
And America has a long, healthy tradition of, especially at the state and local of political corruption and dishonest politicians who do not live only on their salaries. And that's probably been more true here than for most of the time. But beginning in the progressive era, and then rapidly after the 1970s, there's been a major cleanup of American politics. So we've had a period of, this has not been true since time immemorial,
Right.
but rising standards of ethics. So Lyndon Johnson, while he was president, he owned radio and TV stations, and he was a CBS franchisee, and he would meet with the executives of CBS at the White House and renegotiate his deal with CBS. And did he get a better deal? He did get a better deal. Okay, so after a lot of this was secret. At the time, it all came out during the Watergate hearings because one of the lines of defense that pro-Nixon people had is, what are you talking about? Johnson did it, Kennedy did it, not Eisenhower, but and Roosevelt did it. And the Nixon people were right. His predecessors had done all of these things. And so they decided, okay, we're passing a bunch of new rules and establishing a bunch of new norms. The president can't run a business. No one ever put that into law. It's impossible to put into law. Also, we put into a norm, and by the way, the president's immediate relatives shouldn't run businesses. You trading on how do you write that down? What's an immediate relative? But that also became understood. The president's relatives had to keep their noses clean. And so we had a period of increased public integrity. Now that's come under some pressure in very recent years, but Donald Trump has ripped all of that up. And we are now back to standards of public integrity. We have never seen this. I mean, no president has run a business enterprise of this scale from the White House. Lyndon Johnson is like a couple of TV stations, and nobody before Johnson had ever done anything like it. Meanwhile, the role of the family, this is like something out of Kazakhstan. It's completely un-American. But
not clearly illegal, which is the problem.
It's absolutely
contrary to norm.
It's absolutely not illegal. It's clearly legal. By the way, it's not clear that it's illegal for a candidate for president if he can avoid technical violations of the elections law. It's not clear that it's illegal for him to work with a hostile foreign intelligence agency to do damage to his opponent.
That's trickier in terms of how he does it.
It's hard to imagine how you do it without tripping over some
Right.
technical statutes,
Right.
elections law and foreign agents registration.
Exactly.
But we can talk about this later, I can give you scenarios where you can do it without tripping those things, and it's just shocking, but it's not illegal.
So whether it's viewing the president's relationship to the director of the FBI, in a sort of conventional at-will employment way, as opposed to respecting the norm around honoring the term of years that the director's been appointed to in absence of really strong cause, or whether it's not separating from business interests upon entering the White House, and really the person of the president and his family continuing to run a business in ways that seems clearly to be leveraging the position in the government to the benefit of the business. To the extent that those norms have been not just threatened, but have been ripped apart, how do those or any other norms get rebuilt? The thing about the way one would describe norms is that they aren't invented overnight. They're the result of a kind of accumulation of practice and wisdom. There's reflected some sort of institutional settlement or institutional equilibrium the political scientists will talk about. So those equilibria have been upended.
Yeah.
Supposing there were sufficient people in positions of power and influence and voters interested in restoring those norms, how does it happen?
Well, this is where my maybe instinctive pessimism kicks in. That one of the things that is part of the tone of anger of the book is that these norms, I mean, if you know American history and American law, they were really hard to build, and they have been very imperfect. They've been better for the president than for Congress, better at the federal level than at the state level, better at the state level than at the local level, but always very imperfect. But they can be smashed really, really easily. And once smashed, hard to put them back together. If you've got a society where policemen are in the habit of taking gratuities, it's really hard to clean that up. And you can be a very advanced country. You can be Italy, and you still, it's hard to do. On the other hand, so don't initiate it, because the road back is not so clear. One of the questions that will be true for whoever is president in the future. I mean, I can imagine, for example, that if there's a revulsion against Donald Trump, if he does badly politically and the Republican Party does badly politically, I can imagine that some future Congress will pass a law that the president must declare his tax returns. That is no longer voluntary. That's very easy for me to imagine. How do we write the law that the president's family cannot trade on his position? I don't know. I don't know how you write that law. One of the reasons that in Hungary, the far-right party, Jobbik, they're neo-fascists, one of the reasons for their success is they voluntarily publish disclosure forms, not only for the members of parliament, but for their wives, children, and parents. And that they send a message of, because they know that in the Orban party, Orban puts all of his assets into the hands of his immediate relatives. How do you, and there are, we hope they're honorable public servants, but the typical public servant, he looks at the Trump family. If this works, why wouldn't you do it?
So if there's an opportunity for restoration of norms, and I think you're right that certainly American history and law suggests that moments of extravagant new exercises of executive power are often responded to at some later moment with legislation. So some of these shattered norms may well return, tax returns, for example, in the form of legislation, which is its own question about whether the best way to impose a norm like that is through a law.
Well, that's really, so one of the chapter of the book that has gotten the least attention, and that I now spend a lot of time talking about, was I think it makes a point that we don't talk about enough, is a chapter called autoimmune disorders. The system responds in self-defense in ways that are very dangerous. I mean, we will pass laws, but one of the things to be aware of when we pass laws, this is a highly legalistic country, and Americans tend to think if it's not illegal, then it's okay. And so every time you pass a law, yes, you prohibit certain activities, but you in effect give a blessing to others. And that is going to be, one of the things I really dread is the coming debate over collusion. Because as the facts come into view, hypothetically, if it turns out that lower level people did things that broke laws, but higher level people did things that did not break laws, but are just shocking, that we are going to end up, in effect, legitimating the things. It's going to be very hard to persuade people that a non-illegal form of cooperation with Russia. A lot of people are going to have a strong stake in believing, well, they'll begin by saying, I don't like it, but it's not a crime, and they'll end by saying, well, it's fine. And you can see, if you watch the Hannity program, you can see that process is already 2/3 of the way to completion. If you start passing these laws in the future, that what you're going to end up doing is laws extinguish norms because they create an implicit permission for the thing on the other side of the legal line.
I think that's an incredibly important point. That seems to be what's happening in the, as you say, as articles, et cetera, are published defending the notion that the president has the authority to terminate the director of the FBI effectively whenever he wants. That's true as a technical legal matter, and the form of that argument just takes the air out of the room for a discussion of things that might be lawful, but not good, bad ideas.
When President Obama presided at the ceremony where he welcomed his first crop of US attorneys, he famously said to them, I appointed you, but you do not work for me. And that's the attitude that we sort of expect. James Comey, I think, made the point that he had, if I remember this right, one face-to-face conversation with George W. Bush and one face-to-face conversation with Barack Obama. And I mean, actually, it turns out it's very rare that the president and the FBI director ever talk one-on-one, and has been rare ever since the J. Edgar Hoover days for reasons that have to do with everyone remembers what the president
what they were talking about.
We don't want that to happen anymore.
And certainly the thing, if they were talking, the last thing you'd expect them to be talking about is a pending case, a pending investigation of some kind. Again, a norm, not a law. So we might think about different actors that could be involved in helping us restore norms if it's possible to do. And one set of actors are the other members of the party that the president has declared himself to be a member of. Where does the Republican Party show up in this?
I think that there has been some invisible gravity from members of the party on Trump. That is why there hasn't been a firing yet of the special counsel. I think it
or maybe of the Attorney General as well.
Yeah, so I think you're probably right about that. I think there's some communication, like, you know, if only because it would make their lives, at least at that moment, difficult. Now, I don't know that that will continue to be true, and the fact that people do it invisibly rather than visibly is itself disconcerting. But the relationship between, I mean, in some ways, it's a kind of Stockholm syndrome, and literally so, in that the Republican Party began as a hostage, a kidnapped victim. Trump forced himself upon the Republican Party. He was not, about a third of the primary electorate really liked him, and 2/3 did not, but enough of them yielded to make him the nominee. The party, the donors were very reluctant. I talk in the book about the flow of money to Donald Trump. Even after he won the nomination, he did not do very well in tapping the deep pockets. He only began to get large amounts of money from the major donors after he outright won the election. And then the money flowed to his inaugural fund, which is one of the most mysterious sources of money at a president's disposal. But he's bent them to his will, and they are now entrapped. But what he's offered them, not as, I don't want to say, not as in a conscious way, but this is the offer that has grown up, is because he is so amazingly indifferent to policy. And because he is ignorant of a lot of the main traditional rules of politics, he's been willing to sign legislation that any normal self-preserving first-term Republican president would not sign. I mean, this tax bill, it would, maybe President Ryan would sign it because he's a believer, but a President Rubio would say, I don't know, you got to give me something here for people in the middle, and we can't hit New York and California quite like this. We're going to wipe out, you know, our House delegations. You have to give me a little something here. Trump signed it without probably understanding very much. In return for this, he signed amazing things. And he will sign the repeal of Dodd-Frank if they send it to him. Again, a lot of things that a normal, self-preserving first-term president would be cautious of. So he
apparently will sign things on the other side that a Republican president wouldn't sign either, or at least many would not, like announcing that he's open to a path for citizenship for people who are undocumented, right?
Well, he said the great thing when you will say anything without remembering it or being held to it, he'll say anything.
Right, it might or might not be true that he would sign it.
He'll make noises about things. But what he offered, but then he has a demand in return. In return for signing your unpopular bills, you have to give me impunity. And that one of the autoimmune disorders is the destruction of congressional oversight of intelligence. What has happened at the House Intelligence Committee is really serious. I think it has been, the United States creates intelligence services during World War II, they're normalized during the Cold War. For 35 years, they didn't tell Congress anything about what they were up to. And they told the president not very much about what they were up to. So in the scandals in the middle 1970s, new rules were put in place where they have to tell the president more, and they have to tell the Congress something. But their cooperation with Congress is highly voluntary, and it's always a struggle. But these two, so the Congress responded. They created a Senate Intelligence Committee and a House Intelligence Committee, and they until now, operated at a higher standard than other committees. They were much more closed-mouthed. They didn't leak. They had a really good record of, even the House Committee had a good record of not leaking. The people who were appointed to the people were not just your typical, it was an honor. And there was enough trust that some things were shared. So when you have a complete partisan clown using his position on the committee to attack the integrity of the FBI, which is an intelligence agency, what is going to happen to the flow of information to those committees? I mean, I think it's going to slow. And so today you think, yeah, it's probably just as well not to tell Devin Nunes any important secrets. But he won't always be there.
Yeah, and his successor will be there.
His successor will be there, and they'll be saying, well, you could turn into Devin Nunes too, so it's better that you not know. And I ask a question to consider. I mean, how informative do you think the president's daily intelligence brief is right now? That he blurts, so you're the CIA or whoever puts this thing together. You know the president blurts secrets, not only to the Russians, but he told the president of the Philippines where America's nuclear submarines were on the day he happened to talk to him, which is really useful. If you're planning a nuclear decapitation strike against the United States, you want to know that. And he told that, blurted that to Duterte to show off. He shares it with a reported 14 people Obama and Bush would have shared it with maybe 4 or 5, including the chief of staff, the national security advisor, one or two other supremely high officials, 14 people, one of them being a person without a permanent security clearance, the president's son-in-law, who has complicated ties, financial ties to Russia, China, and Qatar. I mean, if you're the head of the CIA, well, if the president asks, we won't refuse to tell him, obviously. But if he doesn't ask, let's just fill it with pictures. And that is a habit that is highly congenial to the CIA, because they don't trust people outside the agency. They don't trust people in the FBI. They don't trust people in the Pentagon. They've never really loved the White House.
So any attempt to try and reform this, though, by people sitting in elected office now that doesn't have some serious buy-in on the Republican side, though, is just going to be coded as partisanship. Right. Any attempt to deal with this, and the same way, whatever one makes of Nunes and Schiff, I think the country is seeing that as a partisan fight between two. And so how do we get past that? You talk in the book, you call for a new politics of commonality. Yeah. And I was struck by your referring to yourself earlier as a pessimist, because that doesn't sound pessimistic. That sounds really optimistic. And I want you to convince us why it's realistic optimism.
Well, okay, so I'm not here with a 4-point plan of things that can be implemented that will make all of this better. And I don't think it's going to be easy. So I am in the camp, as I said earlier, there's this big debate in Washington about, are we going to be able to shake this off pretty easily? The case, and I don't believe that. And the calling for this kind of politics common, it's a big ask. And I say it depends on people. That's one of the reasons I do this Johnny Appleseed touring around the country that I'm doing. The existing party system can't cope with this. That if we get through this, what we're going to have on the other side is a party system that looks very different from the party system that we've recently had. Now, that's not impossible. One of the things we're living longer and longer, thank goodness. But what that means is that we carry the past with us for longer periods of time. So imagine you're a time traveler standing in the year 1990, and you jump 25 years ahead. Who are the 2 most important politicians in the country? 25 years ahead to 2015. Who are the 2 most important politicians in the country? Bush and Clinton. Who's the most difficult person to deal with in Washington? Newt Gingrich. What are the issues? Healthcare in Iraq. I mean, nothing changes. Now imagine that time traveler going back 25 years from 1990 to 1965. The most powerful man in Washington is the head of the AFL-CIO. There are liberal Republicans. It is a different world. They're just passing the Voting Rights Act. It's a different world. So, and the party system is completely different. The way we get out of this is today's Republican Party faces this problem. It is passionately, intensely, sincerely committed to an agenda that cannot pass Democratic muster. And its way out of that dilemma is to de-democratize the American political system. The change will come when conservative-minded people, some of them Republicans, some of them not, say, what we need is a party of the center-right, party of enterprise, party of private property, a party of the haves. That's what drives it. A party of the people's grandparents live more in the country that wants a program that is accepted. Turning off the symbols of the methods of democracy is not acceptable. So you have to come up with your program, your conservative program, in ways that can pass democratic muster, and that's the only kind of program you can have. And that is by a circuitous route, but that is a very different party system. Now, I believe it can happen because the party systems have changed radically within the lifetimes of people in this room. And the present Republican Party wasn't there forever either. It wasn't there in 1985 or 1975 or 65, but it's been there. It's been growing up since 1990, and especially since 1995, and especially since the Great Recession. And it's now a real fact. And so long as you have it there in this present form, this is the path we're going to tread.
For the audience listening in the future to the podcast of this, I'm going to remind everyone that this is NYU Law School's Brennan Center for Justice program, and we're talking to David Frum, senior editor at the Atlantic and author of the new book, Trumpocracy. Let's come back to just where we were on the party system. Some on this faculty who study law and politics have made a similar call, I think. What they've said is part of the problem with the Republican Party and the Democratic Party is that they are too susceptible of control by the people. And that what both of those parties need is some smoke-filled rooms.
Yeah.
Is some people to assert greater control over the direction of the party, so that it can move in wiser directions. Is that what you're saying?
Look, if you don't remember the original smoke-filled rooms, it's a very attractive idea, but here's the problem. The reason the original smoke-filled rooms worked was the people in the smoke-filled rooms were people who didn't believe in, who thought the purpose of politics was filling postmaster jobs across the country. They were patronage parties. Yeah. And those kinds of parties, they disliked ideas and idealists because they were distractions from the important job of winning elections by saying as little as possible as it took. So you go to the real business of distributing patronage.
Yeah.
Okay, we're not going to unpass civil service reform, nor of course do we want to. Right. So you're not going to have brokerage patronage parties in the 21st century. And that means that if the people in those smoke-filled rooms are going to be about this, they're going to be concerned with the things that are the stuff of politics today, and those are big concepts. So how do you imagine this kind of partisan change coming? I think it's not just by political tinkering. The kind of changes, the way we'll get onto political stability, if we one day wake up and realize the rapids are behind us, these are the things that will have happened. One is the pace of economic growth will have picked up. So there's more to go around. The second is, I don't know a tactful way to put this. I'm just going to put it untactfully. The baby boomers will be a lot older. And there may perhaps be fewer of them. And the reason that point about the baby boomers being older is important is this. Right now, the baby boomers are in their 60s. That means they still have a lot of private savings. That means they still think of themselves as people who are paying in as well as receiving from the state. And that means there are approximately equal numbers of men and women. 12 years from now, the baby boomer generation will be much more female. It will have mostly exhausted its private savings, and it will be much more dependent on the state. And its politics will look very different, and they will also be weaker relative to everybody else. They will not be able to say, throw all the other luggage of the state overboard in order to save our Medicare, our Social Security. So I think the fading of the baby boom generation will make a difference. I think an abatement in the rate of immigration and demographic change will be really important because mass immigration is the proximate cause of destabilization in all of the democracies. And then I think...
Isn't it also a source of energy in a lot of democracies?
It's a source of economic energy and political instability. And the problem with it, of course, is as your native birth rate declines, as your economy, this is the tragic paradox, the economies that need immigration most are the societies that can cope with it least. And I think this is a case where you have to put social stability as your top interest. And then one other thing that I think when we look at it behind us is the attempt to shrink the electorate will have failed. And if that has happened, then the party of the haves, the party of the center-right will say, we have no choice but to look more like the Australian Liberals, the Canadian Conservatives, the British Conservatives, the German Christian Democrats, and accept a social, be a right-of-center party within a consensus about a social insurance state.
So this is really, I think, if I understand, it's an argument that the only realistic version of a conservative-leaning party that could be successful is one that has to come back from the brink on these points, the one that has to establish a workable relationship with a larger electorate.
Right. And people are not going to reason their way to that outcome.
Right. They need to experience some failures.
I am now raising my third teenager, so I'm going to repeat a lecture. I repeat to Republicans a lecture that I repeated to my children without success. And that it's good to learn from experience, but it's better to learn from other people's experience. but you know, if you've had teenagers, sometimes people insist on learning things the hard way. And so I've been saying to Republicans for, gosh, since the middle of the last decade, you know, I can see this. Don't be like this. It's probably going nowhere good. But I think they will arrive at it not by thinking their way through it, but through pain, through electoral pain.
In some ways, I think what the book lays bare, though, are the kinds of costs the country might bear in the meantime. So that could be the long-run correction. Yeah. In the meantime, you know, we could have every incentive for politicians, whether this president or others, to continue to exploit the apparently permissible casual relationship that leaders of our government can have with the truth, to make a set of claims, to try and create realities that, if they were true, would mobilize a sort of politics that could sustain them for a period of time. And so again, you're not charged with solving all of this for us as much as for diagnosing the depth of the problem. But one piece of it we haven't talked about is this erosion of respect for some common understanding of facts. That Senator Moynihan's idea that you can have your own opinion but not your own facts.
Well, we've expanded the frontiers of human rights.
Yeah,
And now
right.
Now you can have your own facts.
Talk about that and what, if anything, to do about that.
Well, in the days where
this is the last question, by the way. Okay. We'll go to questions from the audience after this, and so if you have questions, I think we're going to take them at the microphone over here. So line up on this side, please. Truth.
Okay. Social media have enabled many people to have their own relationship with truth. We've all seen that. But I am not somebody who believes this is what we're seeing here is mostly a social media phenomenon. Okay. I think what we're seeing is this. The reason we used to have an agreed upon set of facts was not that in 1972 a lot of people didn't believe a lot of crazy things. Because in 1972 a lot of people did believe a lot of crazy things. But what you had in 1972 was a much more cohesive political, social, economic, and financial elite that agreed among themselves on what the facts, as far as they were concerned, were. So the breakdown.
So
of
not a broad
facts,
consensus, but an elite consensus.
An elite consensus
about material facts.
So people believed all kinds of things out there, and there were all these newsletters. I used to get them. I was involved in right-wing politics for a long time. They're pretty crazy, but you know, there are people who believe that famously fluoridation of the water was a communist plot, but you didn't get into the president's cabinet if you believe that. You didn't become governor of a state if you believe that. You didn't have access to television if you believe that. So people might believe it, but there was an elite consensus, and that was operational. So the reason for the breakdown of this truth, I don't think it's driven by technology. Technology accelerates it and empowers it, but it's also a product of the way we play politics more savagely and the breakdown of elite consensus.
That's very well said. Okay, we're going to turn to questions from the audience. 2 ground rules. We have a queue here. So I'm speaking to the folks in the queue and to others who might join it. 2 ground rules. 1 question per person only. That means no subparts, just 1 question. And it must actually be a question. Each of you, I bet, has ideas for longer things that could be said, and they're brilliant. We're going to stipulate, but these have to be questions, and then we'll get as many answers from David as we can. Please, sir. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Christopher Vicciola. I'm on Congressman Jim Himes' campaign. My question is to Mr. Frum. Do you feel President Trump has mental health problems? Because that's come up.
I'm not an expert. I hesitate to diagnose. Let me put this. I think obviously he's got a structure of his brain that's pretty strange. It's pretty obvious he doesn't have the level of empathy that I would like to see in someone who is a member of my family or married to a member of my family. But I think he's a very wily survivor. His skills, his methods work for him. And so if you think of him as somebody who's non-functional, I think you make a mistake.
So let's say Trump drops out before 2020 or has devastating losses in the House in 2018 and whatnot. What happens to all of the very pro-Trump members of Congress? Do you think, do they stay in power? Do they continue as they were?
Well, let's break out those scenarios.
That's good. That was one question.
I was really worried.
Okay, so let's break those in. Supposing there are major losses in 2018, although remember the economy's strong, wages are rising, and many people outside of in the red states are paying less tax and like it. So they may not, the losses may not be as devastating as usually predictable. Let's say they are. My prediction of what happens then is that the remnants of the Republican Party have to cling tighter to Donald Trump. It takes the House, Senate, and President to pass a tax cut, but it takes only the President to defend a tax cut. They become more beholden to him. It's hard for me to imagine a scenario where, barring some extreme health event, he doesn't seek re-election. If there is some absolutely conclusive scandal, it may be that you move your way to some kind of post-Trump Republicanism. But my guess is that the scandal, that what Bob Mueller, my own guess, and it's just a guess, and what Mueller will reveal, is he'll reveal a bunch of things that are illegal, but that involve smaller level people and that are not core to what happened in 2016. And the things that he will reveal that are core to what happened in 2016 are likely to be not illegal. And so it will be possible for many people to be bound to Donald Trump. I mean, the day may come when there are Republicans who say, that guy, I never heard of him. But that day is a ways off.
I'm a researcher at the Brennan Center. Thank you for speaking here today. It seems like one of the reasons the president has been able to smash these norms and institutions is because the American people don't have a terrible amount of trust in these institutions, you know, people with fancy degrees and fancy office buildings in New York or DC. How do those institutions try to regain the trust of the people so maybe it's not so easy to smash them?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that we have learned about ourselves that we didn't know was the democratic norms and institutions that grew up after the war, grew up in the New Deal and Progressive era, they had two selling points. One was they respected human dignity and human rights and protected people from the midnight knock on the door. And the second, especially after World War II, was they delivered material goods in a way that had never, to ordinary people, in a way that had never been seen before. And those two things were this, people don't separate these things in their mind. They seem the same. What has happened beginning in the early 1990s, and especially since the Great Recession, is these systems, not just in this country, are not delivering the goods for ordinary people in the way they used to. And so we are inviting ordinary people to, we're urging them to care about the procedural benefits, the dignity part. And what we're discovering is that was only part of the deal and maybe the less powerful part. So if you want to get people excited about liberal democratic norms, liberal democracy has to start delivering the goods in a much more spectacular way.
I haven't read the book yet, but I don't imagine there's much in the way of relationship advice in Trumpocracy, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts.
Paperback edition.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how we hold on to each other and our important relationships in these divisive times.
Well, surprisingly, although there's no relationship advice, there is a lot of relationship comment in the book because one of the ways that America is coming apart, and I think it's very important what happened in 2016, is that men and women are moving apart in this way. Among people under 30, they are less likely to be married or living with somebody than at any point since record keeping began. And censorious older people like me say, well, we know all about that hookup culture, but when you actually look at for some pretty reliable statistics, it turns out they're actually not even sexually involved with one another outside of marriage. And I won't take time now to talk about why I think that's so, and maybe and we're just guessing anyway at that point. But the consequences are real, which is you have, as young men and women come apart, that you have a very powerful politics of male anger, not just in this country, that appeals to men who are living, or young men who are living apart from women who can't, knock it off. Are you kidding? I think that's what a lot of what drives the gun debate. That the gun debate, what the gun offers is male power at a time when many men feel they're losing it. And it offers male power in a way that women would once, if they lived in the house with the man, would once have checked. You have to get rid of that gun while we have the baby, but now they don't, they live apart. So one of the ways that we are troubled as a society, is that Americans are forming fewer intimate relationships later in life and holding on to them less well.
What if the stakes are even higher than what you're talking about?
Oh,
and
no.
we're in a, and your picture is actually rosy. My concern is that given that maybe 25 to 35% of our population actually believes deeply and profoundly what Fox and Trump are saying, they believe this stuff, and most of them are well armed. Putin doesn't care about what happens in this country. He wants to bring us down to his level. Trump, I don't see any conscience or decency at all in Trump. He's capable of seeing half of us die rather than him losing power. Is there any, I think that you have to consider the possibility, and your idea of, can we go the way of what Milosevic did to Yugoslavia? Are our divisions that deep? Can we sink to that level? Because prior to Milosevic, everybody thought that place was cool. They were all marrying each other in Belgrade. They had a nice life. And they thought it could never happen there. Can it happen here?
Well,
and how can we stop it? If it, enough said.
Okay, so here's some good news. That it really is observably true that modern politics is way less violent than it used to be, both between nations and within nations. And modern authoritarians are way less violent than their predecessors were. I mean, Vladimir Putin is probably the most murderous authoritarian leader on the planet. But what he has done over his career, Stalin wouldn't think he'd earned lunch if he did it in a single day. So I think there are many more inhibitions on the use of violence than there used to be. And Milosevic is something of an exception to that rule, but also something of a confirmation of that rule, because the violence, he was there at the infancy of CNN, and the violence was broadcast, and that there was an international reaction that was way disproportionate to the strategic significance of what was happening in Yugoslavia. I think one of the things that, as horrifying as these school massacres are, and as much as they seem to be getting worse and feeding on each other, it's also true that every one of them is a national event. And this recent one seems to be kind of a miraculous coming together of the nation, that we are knowing these people. They're insisting we know them. And because of that video from inside the school, that we often draw a kind of veil of obscurity over what it is like to be on the receiving end of such an atrocity. And as recently as Columbine, 20 years ago, it was impossible for anyone to see what happened. We read about what happened in the classroom, but we couldn't see it. We're seeing it. And seeing it, and this is maybe goes to the last question. One of the things that maybe at the profoundest level that this whole struggle is about is this. The Romans built the Colosseum about the year 70. It continued operational, I think, into the early 500s. 400 years. I think they had shows twice a week. It was mostly full. Watching people hack each other to pieces. That there is a deep human appetite for cruelty. It fascinates us. St. Augustine used to go to the games in his town, and he would pray because he was so fascinated. He found them so tempting and fascinating. One of the founders of the Christian faith. But there's also a part of us that revolts from cruelty, that when we see it, we hate it. And that's what's happening with the video from Florida. And so maybe there's a little test in these days for all of us of which of these parts of our nature comes to the fore. And I think, for me, I think one of the reasons, I asked myself, why have I had such an intense personal reaction to the Trump presidency? Because as my wife will testify is here, I can't abide him. So why do I feel so strongly about that? And I think it is having to watch cruelty put on this jumbotron in the center of the world, and you have to gaze on it every day. And what do you think of it? And you either can stand it or you can't.
May common human decency prevail.
Good evening. I'm Natalie Tennant. I work at the Brennan Center also, and I appreciate your being here. And Dean, thank you. Before I came to the Brennan Center, I was Secretary of State of West Virginia. And the secretaries across the country have now been considered the first responders to democracy. And I think that we saw that a lot, especially this summer with the Presidential Commission on the Integrity for Elections. And so my question is, though, with the reaction from Trump in 2016. If he doesn't win in 2018 or his party have a majority in 2018, could we see another commission that he wants to form to try and prove a point? And how do we defend that again?
Right, well, that's a fantastic point. I mean, I talk a little bit about the commission in the book. It was still a live thing when I wrote the book. That is an example. One of the Achilles heels of this administration is its slovenliness and the lack of follow-through and the chaotic staff, because they could have made much more of a success of that commission if they'd worked harder at it. And they may well be back. And you can also imagine a less extreme version of that coalition making greater inroads. And there's, I mean, the battle over what is the Pennsylvania redistricting is, I think, a foretaste of what is to come. I think all of these things are going to be very, very live issues. And right now, here's a way to think about this. I use this example of the book. So right now, the Republican Party, since 2016, has more power than it did at any time since the 1920s. 2 houses of Congress, I forget now what percentage of the state, but enormous advantage in state legislatures. You have to go back to the Coolidge era. But when Coolidge was as dominant as the Republicans are now, the Republicans were also dominant in the knowledge centers of the country. In the election of 1924, Coolidge won 55% of the vote in New York, the financial and intellectual center of the country. He won 65% of the vote in Pennsylvania, the industrial center. He won almost 75% of the vote in the new economy state of Michigan. Today, although the Republicans are any place where a product is invented or a song is written or a TV series or a new idea, they are absent. And so you have this disconnect between the creativity of the country and the voting power of the country that I don't think has ever happened before in American life. It's as if William Jennings Bryan somehow got hold of all of the instrumentalities of power in 1896. And you can't hold on to that consensually. You have to hold on to it. You either lose it, which is one outcome, or you find yourself having to de-democratize the state.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again. I really enjoyed the discussion. I just was thinking a little bit about your point about majoritarian politics. I mean, you're both, optimistic about that prospect, and I guess
I don't
my
know
question.
that we're optimistic at all about that prospect.
Okay, well, optimistic enough, I guess, relative to where I am. But speaking as a moderate, I find, the Republican brand as a result of this presidency, just tarnished. I mean, it's very difficult for somebody like me. I'm an immigrant to this country. It's very difficult to extricate the rhetoric, sort of the anti-immigrant sentiment from the brand of this party. And I think there are a lot of people like me that potentially could have been in the center of the party or to the center right of the party perhaps, but there's really no place for us to go anymore. And if this majoritarian impulse is where we're headed, we have a more diverse electorate, but we have a center, a good 35% of the country maybe is even considers itself independent. And so can we really continue to keep this party the way that it is? I mean, do we need to start a new party?
Well, let me offer, that's a very pessimistic statement. Let me offer some basis for hope, because I end the book that way. And it's not tacked on like those 14-point plans. It's really organic to the argument of the book. So here are some things I see that have really inspired me, that have been some, I call them the gifts of Trump, things he's giving us. The first is that he's helped us to see the country better and its problems. I mentioned before, we have these incredible coastal knowledge centers where the recovery from the Great Recession is complete, where new progress is being made, where all these amazing products are being invented, and the idea that we are living through the greatest substance abuse addiction since before Prohibition. that more Americans are dying of drugs than died in Vietnam in a shorter period of time. That's something we didn't see. I mean, you go. I have a section in the book about how invisible it was if you look at the indexes of newspapers in the year 2016, and suddenly we see it. We see what is happening to people who are your countrymen. I think you've talked a lot in your questions about truth. The phrase post-truth began not as a criticism, but as a compliment. And it began in universities like this one, where the claim was that truth was overbearing, it was out of date, it was, Michel Foucault suggested it was literally totalitarian, and his disciples said we need a post-truth, we need to replace the tyranny of truth with the freedom of truths. And what Donald Trump has shown is the opposite of truth is not truths, the opposite of truth is lying. And democracy can't bear it, because in a democracy we all make decisions for ourselves. And if we live in a tiny aristocracy, word of mouth would tell us what was going on. But sovereign power is vested in people who rely on mass media to know how to cast their vote intelligently. Truth is indispensable, and that is something. And suddenly you see people in places like this talking about truth in a way that I think you would have found professionally embarrassing 24 months ago. You see a sudden awakening. This is gratifying to those of us on the right-hand side of the spectrum. 4 years ago, if I were in a hall like this and I said, Edward Snowden is not a hero, I don't know how receptive an audience I would have found. But I think one of the things that we have all been forced to confront is danger in the modern age comes not only from tanks and rockets, but it's in the form of clandestine cyber attack. And the people who stand on guard against that at the National Security Agency and the FBI and, yes, the CIA are every bit as integral to America's defense as the Army, Navy, and Coast Guard. And the people who take it on themselves to subvert those institutions are attacking the security of the country. I think, to your point about the relation between groups, I mean, I think that at a different time, the Me Too debate could have been just as explosive as it is, but I don't think it would have been seen as central. It would have been seen as another issue in politics along with the deficit and what are we going to do about North Korea. I think that the Trump experience has forced people to confront how people are treated in daily life is absolutely integral to the political structure of your country, because you've seen that, and it's not just incidental to who he is, that Donald Trump is an abuser of women. It is absolutely crucial to who he is. And that contempt for women was not just an incidental theme of the 2016 election, it was central. And it was central, by the way, to some of the Democratic primaries, as well as the general election. The gender gap between Sanders and Clinton in the Democratic primary was bigger than the gender gap in the general election. Yeah. So I think it may be that we will look back on this and see this is a period of American renewal and self-discovery and commitment to higher ideas and to better standards. And if that happens, we may end up, that it may be that we will owe him a perverse debt of thanks.
Wow. With apologies to the
okay, that was a
folks
long
still
answer. I'm sorry. That was a long answer.
I'm getting the sign that we're reaching time. That is an amazing note upon which to end. But let me just pose one last question, allow you to close in answer to this, David. I thought what you said about cruelty being a defining characteristic of the public face of this administration was really, for me, very, very meaningful and moving. And I think it's right. It really resonates. And that's a cost that we're all bearing. On the other hand, there at least have been moments in the last year where it seemed like the pace of outrage has been so fast that episodes, events, actions, words, deeds that deserved an entire year of outrage and debate and discussion about what to do are just eclipsed a couple of days later by the next. And somewhere in the midst of that, there's a risk that we're just becoming calloused to this, that we're normalizing it. So how do we, if we pre-commit ourselves to not allowing the normalization to happen, how do we help ensure that we can do that?
It's hard. I mean, it is hard not. Things that happen every day become normal. I mean, you can say don't normalize this, but they do become normal. People who lived through the Blitz found the Blitz became normal. And this is our normality. This is the way we live now. And at some level, you can't let it make you crazy. And you also have to avoid reacting to every little thing, because you will become literally crazy. I try, one of the things that the book did, I think one of the values of doing it at the end of year 1, if I'd done it at the end of year 8, by editing, I would have had to leave out a lot of things. It's a little bit of a diary of things that have happened. Unlike Michael Wolff, I can't promise you any sensational revelations, but it will feel like sensational revelations because you have forgotten 80% of it already.
This is true. Yeah, yeah.
But I think the way you cope with it ultimately is by not trying to master all of the detail, because that's impossible, but by rising above it to seeing the great themes of the specific areas of wrong. And those great themes of wrong do reduce themselves to a manageable number that you can keep track of. And then each atrocity becomes another for instance of that.
The book is Trumpocracy. Please join me in thanking David Frum. Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you.